you will have found his work right now as the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, for those of you who want to, if you haven't been there online, to look it up. He is also a senior contributor for The Federalist and writes columns for many, many, many publications, including the New York Post, Newsweek, Israel Hayom, the Washington Examiner, and Commentary. And he writes about American politics, about the state of Israel and the state of U.S.-Israel relationships. And he also writes about the arts, in addition to his love of Israel and politics. He also is someone who does a podcast called Top Story. You can find it on Spotify. And you can also find him on YouTube and JBS TV. He has won many, many awards for his writing and his publications. And you will regularly see him on many different programs offering his point of view on important issues of the day, both to this country, to the state of Israel, and to the Jewish people. So again, it is our delight to ask Jonathan Tobin now to speak to us at this time.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you for slightly abridging that biography. I mean, I would hate for you to have to sit through it twice. That would be really cruel and unusual. Although when it's done in full length, I always like, the old line that, if my parents, a blessed memory, if they were still here, my father would have enjoyed it and my mother would have believed it. It is an honor to be here at Beth Shalom, which is a great synagogue, a great institution in our community, as well as a place where I really know so many people. I have so many friends, people who come to me remember my daughter from Pullman or from the various, shows that she was in. So it's really nice to catch up with some of you who I actually haven't seen for a while, as we're all catching up with people after 2 years of isolation. I was asked here to speak about Zionism today, and I'm happy to do so. Although I may go a little bit before 1948, if that's against the rules, but, because I think we need to start in the beginnings. And as I said when I sort of gave you a little taste of my thoughts, there's a great irony about thinking about Israel and Zionism, because Israel and Zionism are one of the great success stories of modern history, truly a miracle of Jewish history, has achieved things that no one would have thought possible. Indeed, of course, when the Zionist movement, the modern Zionist movement began in the late 1890s, when Theodor Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat, and then the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel, which 125 years, just had the 125th anniversary. It was truly a minority phenomenon. Most Jews thought it was a pipe dream or something bad. And it was something that even well into the 20th century, even after the Mandate, Balfour Declaration, most Jews still thought it wouldn't happen, and most non-Jews certainly thought it wouldn't happen as well. And it took an unusual confluence of history and of events and of things unforeseen to those at its beginning. And I just want to say, as I share a few thoughts, I hope this will lead to a discussion more than just me giving a lecture. But we have to ask ourselves, why did Zionism succeed, and yet why is Zionism still under fire? Why is it in some sense more controversial today than it was 30 years ago? Why are we still debating Zionism when the state of Israel is an established fact, and more than an established fact, a major power in the region, a powerful, prosperous country? How is that? It's a conundrum, and it speaks to sort of the ultimate dilemmas of modern Jewish life. But we have to begin by asking, why did it succeed? Well, in one sense, speaking from the perspective of 125 years after Basel, we can say, well, it had to succeed. It was logical. It was needed. It was something that when Herzl, famously, when he was a very assimilated Jew and a correspondent for the leading Viennese newspaper in Paris, the most enlightened, freest city, and in what was perceived as, in many ways, as the freest country in the world at the time. And yet, when he saw the degradation of Alfred Dreyfus, you can still visit the courtyard of the military academy, which is in Paris, across from Les Invalides. I was just there this past summer with my daughter, and where the ceremony of Dreyfus's degradation, which Herzl witnessed. And he heard the mob in this free, enlightened city screaming death to the Jews. And it was the culmination of an understanding that the life of the Jewish people in Europe was, in a sense, a contradiction. How could the Jewish people survive, continue, when they were treated in this way, even in the freest country of Europe, let alone where the majority of Jews who lived either in Russia, in the various parts of the Russian Empire, where they were subject to active discrimination. And, of course, Zionism was his answer. It wasn't the only answer put forward at the time. Many Jews believed, many religious Jews believed that to sort of anticipate the Messiah, to re-enter history without, a direct stroke of divine intervention was itself sacrilege. And indeed, there is still a segment of world Jewry that believes this, the Satmar, some extreme ultra-Orthodox Jews. Other Jews believe that socialism offered the answer, that when a universal sense of brotherhood, that's how Jews would be accepted. Others simply said, well, the answer is assimilation. Indeed, Herzl seriously considered that. But, if you want to know, a great illustration of how assimilation doesn't work, if you go to the new show on Broadway, Leopoldstadt, which I highly recommend, by Tom Stoppard, who most of us didn't know was Jewish until very recently, and indeed he didn't acknowledge his own Judaism, speaks of his family, of people an assimilated Jewish family who thought they could assimilate into the society of Europe, into enlightened Middle Europe in Austria-Hungary, and it failed. It's a heart-rending story and a powerful story, but it speaks to the dilemma of modern Jewish history and what was the answer for the Jewish people. And Herzl's answer was a state of our own, to re-enter history. And that, it led to, as I say, unlikely events. But I think when we speak of sort of myths and facts, and AIPAC used to publish a book every year, Myths and Facts. They don't publish it anymore, or at least certainly not in print. But it's important. There are a few myths that I want to address about Israel, its creation, and the first one is the commonly accepted idea that Israel was the world's compensation to the Jews for the Holocaust. Certainly, the state of Israel was created in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The Holocaust created a degree of sympathy for the Jewish people that had not been there before. As Dara Horn writes in her book, people love dead Jews. And they loved dead Jews then, and they love dead Jews now. They're not so keen on living ones. But there was a sort of a unique window of opportunity where there was sympathy. And, I often speak about media bias and the bias against Israel. But the truth is, there are many reasons for that. A lecture for another day. But one of the most profound reasons is that journalists always look for the underdog. And the Jews then were the underdog. We're not so much the underdogs anymore, which is good, but also a reason why Israel gets bad press. And the notion that Israel was somehow just a gift to the Jews, that the Jews were just handed this foreign country. I think it's very important for us to understand and to reaffirm the notion of the right of the Jews to a homeland, to sovereignty, to the right to live and build, to self-defense, in that specific place, in what the world knew as Palestine before 1948, is based on history, religion, and international law. The Jews are an indigenous people in the land of Israel. It's very important to understand that in the context of our current politics and for why Zionism is controversial. The Jews are not colonists in Israel. They're not imperialist. They didn't go there to oppress people of color. You know, that's another one of the myths, that the idea that Jews are all white, and that Jews are inherently, and of course by the definitions of sort of modern terminology of people of color, the majority of the Jews of Israel are themselves people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa. So that is another myth that we have to dispel. And the idea that it was merely a gift from the world, but of course, yes, the United Nations in 1947 voted to create a Jewish state and an Arab state, in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. But the world did not fight to create that state. It was not handed in the famous, and to use the terminology of the great Hebrew poem, Silver Platter by Alterman, the silver platter on which the Jewish state was offered was on the lives and the sacrifice of the Jewish people, of the Jewish youth, of the Yishuv, and of the sacrifice of the Jewish people and the dedication of the Jewish people to accomplish this. It wasn't merely a vote, it was something for which the Jews created. It was their re-entry into history. That was Herzl's insight, it was his genius, and that's why it was so important. So Israel was created against the odds, against everyone's expectations. But 74 years later, what are our challenges? Well, some of them are just very fundamental. Those of us who go to Israel, those of us who cover or write about Israel, we understand that in some senses it's a crazy country full of, obstreperous, anarchist Jews who don't like to be told anything, who don't like to stand in line, right? But it is also an experiment. Only 74 years into its history, we have to have some perspective in that it was we speak of the ingathering of the peoples, but it truly is. All of these different Jewish communities who wound up being plopped together in this Jewish state, Mizrahim, people from North Africa and the Middle East, from Iraq, from Iran, from Morocco, along with Jews from Poland, Jews from the West, vastly different ideas about governance, vastly ideas about Jewish identity, about Jewish practice, all smushed together in this little tiny country. And we wonder that it has political strife. We wonder that it has social strife. But the truth is, we have to have some perspective on it, that it has the fact that it was able to create a polity, create a state, have a functioning government, create an army, create an economy. Yes, it was a long process, and for the first 40 years or so, they were trying sort of what I might call the East German model of economics with socialism, only gradually coming out of it, and still not quite. It talks about itself as the startup nation, first world economy. It still has many vestiges of its past, some which are good, some not so good. But it, along with that, was created basic problems between Jews from different backgrounds, between the Mizrahim and the Ashkenazim, which have largely, not completely, but in many respects been ameliorated by the fact that Jews intermarry. Something that 100 years ago, there was a terrible Netflix show about the last beauty, about intermarriage, between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and how hard it was. But the fact is, it's happened so often that has, to some extent, ameliorated the divide. Of course, we have now other communities, not merely, the Mizrahim, but now the Russians came in, and they are a separate community as well. And again, another clashing ideology. And yet, it all still somehow kind of works in this despair. But above all, we have the religious-secular divide, and that is one that is not resolved by any close, and nowhere close to being resolved. And indeed, you could say it's growing worse because the Haredim are growing in numbers. There is sort of, the Jewish community in Israel is unique among sort of Western first world, countries, in that there is a positive population growth among all communities, much more so among the Haredim than others. But we have a situation where a large segment of Israeli society doesn't, and one of the most controversial aspects is that the men, the people don't serve in the army, and that is a sense of great resentment. Not so much to the people in the army, who, if they will tell you off the record that the last thing they need is, have to training tens of thousands of Haredi Jews who, had no gym in school and who are completely unprepared for it. But the greater problem is that they are not part of the economy, in that Haredi society basically treats anybody who works for a living with a certain disdain, and that the ideal, and many of whom are not by no means scholars, or simply studying in kollels, not being economically productive, being supported poorly by their wives, whom themselves are not properly educated to enter the economy, and it's created massive poverty, and that's an enormous problem. Just to sort of give you a little story, back in 2009, when I was at Commentary Magazine, I commissioned an article from Michael Oren, the historian, about the existential threats to Israel, and he included in it, and indeed his conclusion was that the greatest existential threat to Israel was the religious-secular divide, and what to do about a Haredi population that was outside of both the economy and the security apparatus. And it was a great piece, and by the time we had edited it, and it was, the edition was at the printer, and then he was, tapped by then Prime Minister Netanyahu to be ambassador to the United States. And I think among the first things he did was to call us and say, you have to kill that article. I can't be on record as Israel's ambassador saying that about the Haredim. And I was like, sorry, it's already been printed. It's about to be mailed out. And he wasn't too happy about that, but he got over it. So that is a problem. That is a challenge. And I think, as with other problems, even with the ethnic divides within Israel, even there are glimmers of hope. Because although it's still small, there are more Haredim being integrated into the economy. There are even some more who are volunteering for the IDF. So even the most intractable problems, over time get resolved. But of course, the greatest challenge, the challenge that I think most of us are focused on the most, is the security challenge. And the fact is that Israel has not enjoyed a day of peace, in all of its, of complete peace, in the entirety of its 74 years of history. That it remains a country that is not recognized by much of the world, that it remains a country that is still faced with the same dilemma it was faced in 1948, and indeed when Balfour declared that there is a sizable population within the borders between the Jordan and the sea who are not reconciled to the idea of a Jewish state, and who don't want there to be a Jewish state and want to chart their own path. This is something, I think, again, I want to put some perspective in it. In 1967, when Israel found itself in possession of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, as well as Gaza, everyone said, well, this can't persist. I mean, Israel may claim Jerusalem. Certainly the Jews had no idea of giving up Jerusalem and still don't. But the idea was, well, this is just a temporary situation. It cannot last. And even if you go forward, say, to the beginnings of when my career in journalism, some 35 years ago or more, I mean, commonplace was to say, you know, this is a situation that cannot last. It's a problem that must be solved. It's an existential problem for Israel, and Israel cannot prosper. It cannot ever make peace with its Arab neighbors until it resolves the question with the Palestinian Arabs. And yet, it has still not resolved it. It still goes on. 50 years later, the same anomalous situation exists. There is still no peace. There is still no, quite frankly, it's not on the horizon of peace with the Palestinians. And there are many, especially in this country, who stick to the idea that Israel is endangered by this and Israel must resolve it. And that's understandable. But the problem is that it is locked into this situation, but it cannot be solved by itself. Shimon Peres like to say, and Yitzhak Rabin like to say, don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. But as it turns out, Israel needed to make peace with enemies who wanted to make peace. And one of the great disconnects and sort of part of the mythical aspect of understanding the situation for American Jews is that it is clearly still true. I think it was certainly true when the Oslo process began in 1993, that the majority of Israeli Jews, indeed I would say the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews, were willing to make serious sacrifices territorially to accommodate the Palestinians, to bring the long conflict, the century-old conflict, to an end. And to that end made serious sacrifices. But that mindset has largely changed. Since the collapse of Oslo after 2000, when Ehud Barak, then Prime Minister, offered the Palestinians, after several negotiations, offered them at Camp David in 2000, offered Yasser Arafat with Bill Clinton's patronage, an independent state in Gaza, share of Jerusalem, almost all of the West Bank. Arafat said no. He said no again in 2001. His successor said no in 2008. And after Arafat answered the no with a terrorist war of attrition, which we know as the Second Intifada, it changed the way the majority of Israelis, including many who had welcomed and cheered Oslo, thought about the situation, because they realized that there was no partner for peace, as much as they wanted it to be. And I think many of us, as we understand it, really, as much as I think people who believe in peace want to do good, they somehow deny agency to the other side of this equation, which is the Palestinian Arab population, which, unfortunately, it's partly due to their leaders, to movements like Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, that are still stuck in the idea that Palestinian existence is predicated on a war against Zionism. Now, many Jews still, and certainly Golda Meir was one who famously said there is no such Palestinian people, it's a myth. They're right to the extent that there was no separate Palestinian Arab nation, Palestinian Arab people 100 years ago. That's true. But today there is a Palestinian Arab people. Whatever process they went through, there are millions of people who consider themselves Palestinian and don't want to be part of a Jewish state, don't want to be part of another Arab state. Unfortunately, part of that political culture which they have created is that their identity is somehow inextricably linked to the conflict. And people like Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, who rules in the kleptocracy that governs the West Bank, believes that to make peace would be, suicidal. Arafat thought so. And so Israel is still stuck with this dilemma. And it's created, to some extent, it's radicalized many Israelis. Many onlookers of Israel, are shocked that sort of in the coming Israeli elections, which is this Tuesday, that the religious Zionist party, which has an element within it which is led by somebody who used to be a supporter of Meir Kahane, who's, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is very popular, increasingly popular. And this is a function of the fact that Israel is still stuck in this war with entities that are still bent on its destruction, and it has created some radicalization within the Israeli polity. So I think this is something that many American Jews who are well-meaning and who believe in peace and who want Israel to solve its problems kind of can't accept. I'm not certainly defending Ben-Gvir, but what I am saying is that American Jews need to understand that since Oslo, since 2000, there's kind of a political consensus within Israel. And one thing we have to understand, sort of as we lead up to understand what is Zionism, is that the overwhelming majority of Israeli voters right now don't believe that there is a partner for peace. And, if Israel's election were simply conducted on sort of the old lines of the left-right divide, which Israel used to be pretty evenly divided between left and right up through the Oslo years, that's no longer true. The parties are more divided about whether they want Netanyahu to, have another shot at the prime ministership. They're not so divided about security or territory. In fact, I'd say there's very little difference, even between Netanyahu, as much as they try to highlight their differences, between Netanyahu and Lapid and Benny Gantz of his party. In fact, that represents a broad consensus from center-left to center-right that Israel has to deal with the situation as it is. And I think that's something that American Jews have a very hard time understanding, because for many American Jews, it's still 1993. And that land for peace is the obvious formula. That was a very strong argument. I think it was stronger before 1993, not so strong in the eyes of Israelis now. But that leads me to the question of Israel has achieved all that it's achieved. It has become militarily strong. It now has relations with many Arab states. It has a powerful economy. And yet, in this country especially, we're still debating Zionism. This idea that, for many Israelis is just sort of, it's sort of like talking about the founding fathers. It's history. They think it has nothing to do with their lives. It's sort of, Israel is what it is. It exists. What are you talking about? And yet, if you go on any college campus, you read the New York Times, and indeed in some of our political debates, increasingly, Zionism is controversial. It's controversial because there is a growing school of thought, largely on the left, it's sometimes on the far right as well, but differently, that believes that it is an expression of imperialism. It's part of this great debate that we have in this country about something that's called, loosely called critical race theory, intersectionality, and in that way of thinking about the world, Israel is a white colonialist oppressor. This is a complete myth. Israel is not an apartheid state. It's anything but. Israel is a country where there are, with all of its problems, with all of its ethnic divide, with all of the inherent contradictions of trying to have a democracy and a Jewish state and have a state where everybody is equal, it's nothing like the myth that you see that is portrayed in sort of in the academy and in many academic and even many journalistic forums. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And I think at its core, it shows how some of these new theories are, in a sense, a permission slip for anti-Semitism. Because anyone who tells you that they're anti-Zionist, they're not anti-Semitic, you have to ask them, why is it that there is one movement, one people on this planet for whom singular focus to deny them sovereignty in their own country. It exists virtually nowhere else. There is no parallel to the idea that Jews have no rights to live, no rights to sovereignty in their own country. It is unique. We often debate the idea of whether Jews have these rights in a way that we don't debate about any other people. Now, as basically what that boils down to is discrimination against Jews. And as the lawyers would say, the term of art for discrimination against Jews is anti-Semitism. We see this very clearly in not merely just what's published sometimes in the New York Times or farther left publications, or what's heard sometimes even on the floor of Congress. It's routine at the UN now. Just this past week, the United Nations Human Rights Council put forward a Commission of Inquiry report branding Israel as an illegitimate state, an apartheid state. If you read their report, it basically traffics in tropes of anti-Semitism. It comes down to that. Zionism is under fire for the same reasons that Zionism was created. There's a certain irony to that, because Herzl was so right about so much, about what the needs of the Jewish people, about the logic of history, in a way that other people weren't. But he was wrong about one thing. He felt that the creation of a Jewish state, normalizing the Jewish people, that they would have a country like everybody else, would end anti-Semitism. That's not true. Anti-Semitism is a virus. It exists. It is in some ways, as the great scholar Ruth Weiss said, it was the most successful ideology of the 20th century because it was able to attach itself to all other ideologies. It glommed onto fascism, to Nazism, to communism, and then in the late 20th century to Islamism, to extreme Islam. And as such, it has also now become part of the sort of woke leftist catechism about privilege. And that speaks to why Zionism is important, not just for people in Israel, but why it's important for us. Because when people attack Zionism in American forums, they're not really doing much damage to Israel. When the BDS, the Boycott, Divest, Sanction movement, seeks to create these discriminatory boycotts against Israel, against Israelis, against supporters of Israel, does it harm Israel's economy? No. They haven't laid a glove on Israel's economy. Who is targeted by the BDS movement? American Jews. It is a form of discrimination against Jews. You just have to go on any campus, speak to a Jewish student about the difficulties of speaking up for Israel, about how it becomes, there are now actually no Jew-free zones being created. It happened in Berkeley at their law school. We could go on for another half hour citing examples of how discrimination, anti-Zionism becomes discrimination against Jews. So what we have to understand, the primary myth and fact about Zionism for us today in 2022 is that Zionism didn't just provide the formula for Jewish life, for continuing it, for Jewish self-expression. And it does that. Without Israel, American Jewry, world Jewry would be beggared. It is our spiritual, intellectual, civilizational center. It is our anchor. Without it, we are adrift. And those who try to carve out a Jewish identity without Israel are not merely, denying themselves this great benefit, but they are denying the essence of Jewish life. You daven every day. It's been part of our prayers for 2,000 years. For those who will tell you, and I've reported on it's a very material thing where curricula have been created. There was one curricula in particular in California about ethnic studies, which treated Zionism as racism. And when they are confronted by this, there are ongoing lawsuits about it, they said, well, the answer is, well, Judaism is not Zionism. Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism. And even anti-Semitic, anti-Israel activists will claim, well, we like Jews. We just don't like Israel. We don't just like this Zionism stuff. But of course, Zionism is integral to Jewish life, to Jewish identity. And that's why we have to speak up against this sort of intersectional left. And it's very hard. It's increasingly difficult because the whole idea of nationalism of any kind, of separate identity, in some way goes against not merely the woke ethos, but sort of the American ethos of people just being all together. We are a country where we are not sectarian. We encourage, from our very beginnings, that has gone against the grain for us. That's why American Jewry, to some extent American Jewry and Israeli Jewry are two different tribes with two very different ways of looking at the world. Why, if you advocate, within American Jewry, in many communities and speak up for creating Jewish families, you're immediately called a racist and an exclusionary. It's kind of like something you can't even say in polite Jewish company outside of the Orthodox world today. That's part of where we are. And why defending Zionism is so vital for Jewish life. And just in 1948, we learned something. The life of every Jew in this world was made different by the creation of Israel. Wherever they were, whether they were religious or non-religious, Zionist or non-Zionist, Jews stood up a little taller. We saw this even in places where there was no sense of Jewish identity or Jewish education. In the former Soviet Union, books like Exodus, the news that filtered through of the victory of 1967 helped create Jewish identity in a country where Jewish identity had been, and Jewish practice and Jewish religion had been illegal for 50 years. Everywhere it goes, Zionism provides a lifeline and a center for Jewish civilization that is essential not just for creating a Jewish state and helping it to prosper, but for allowing Jewish life to prosper elsewhere. So let me just conclude with two thoughts. The first is that when we list all our problems, when we list all of Israel's problems, the religious-secular divide, what to do about the problem of the Haredim, what to do about ethnic strife, what to do about a security situation that continues, in essence, a war with the Palestinians that is not where the end is not in sight. To be brutally frank, as much as no matter who is in charge, whether it was the left in Israel running things or the right, it's nowhere in sight. And it can lead to some despair. It can lead because we want to change the world. It's a very Jewish thing to believe that things can be perfected. We want to be the agency, and indeed it's integral design that we will create. We will not let ourselves be deterred by what the non-Jewish world does or says. And yet, any student of history will tell you to put it in perspective. From the perspective of 125 years ago, or of 100 years ago, of 74 years ago, or even of 50 years ago, what Israel has accomplished is amazing. It's miraculous. My grandparents grew up in the shtetl and lived to see a Jewish state. They lived to see the blue and white flag fly over Jerusalem. Who would have believed that? We ourselves have lived to see a poor, those of us who may remember our first trips to Israel back in the day when you were asked to bring consumer goods because Israelis didn't have things. It was a very poor country, The Israel today it's a totally different country than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We have to have the patience to understand that these problems, as insoluble as they are still capable of being survived. And even a security situation, a peace process that shows very little hope, well, you know what? Israel managed to prosper. And indeed, Arab nations who, even a few years ago, were being told by our former Secretary of State that no, there will never be peace between Israel and Arab nations without solving the insoluble problem of the Palestinians. They did make peace, and more, God willing, will make in the end. So we have to have faith to see all these problems, to see everything that has happened, should inspire us not to pessimism and despair, but to inspire us to faith and to hope, because Israel has accomplished so much in our lifetimes with all of its problems. My last thought is about what can we do to help with this situation. How do we fight back? People ask me this all the time. What do we do? You know, anti-Semites on college campuses, anti-Semites at the UN, you know, all of the terrible things that they'll read in the media. What can I do about it? My answer is sort of twofold. Obviously, you know, the traditional Jewish activist answer is speak up, you know, arm yourself with the facts, arm your children with the facts, so then when you send them off to college, they're not defenseless. But ultimately, they and we need something more than just the facts and just the old activist spirit. They need something that is more profound and that is still integral to what it means to be a Jew, and that is, we must have courage. Being a Jew has always meant a willingness to stand up against the idols of popular culture in any time. You know, in the time of the Maccabees, it was Hellenism. 100 years ago, it was the forces of modernism. Today, we're having to stand up against the fashion, the intellectual fashions of the day that make Zionism unpopular, and that for a Jewish student to speak up as a Zionist marks him for shunning, silencing. And there's no easy way around this. I say this to audiences like this. I say this when I speak on college campuses and to groups of Jewish students. There's no easy way around it. You have to have the courage to speak up for the truth. Other generations were faced with other similar, different but similar tests. Those Jews who spoke up for rescue during the Holocaust, that small minority, while others were silent. We think of them as the heroes. They have the courage to speak up. We think of the people who first began the movement for freedom of Soviet Jewry, something that is so much a part of the fabric of the history of this region, of this Jewish community. And we know that they have the courage to speak up when even Jewish organizations and the whole Jewish establishment was not interested in it. They created it. They did it. They spoke up. They stood up. When it wasn't popular, we think of the Soviet Jewry movement of the mass demonstration in 1987 when we brought 250,000 people to Washington. 15 years before that, there weren't 250,000 people. It was a very, very small movement. It was just a lot of, as we say in Hebrew, boshim, of dissidents, of people who were willing to speak up. Today, in a sense, we're faced with the same challenge. Are you willing to be a dissident? Are you willing to face up to the anger and the shunning that can be yours if you are speaking in what is saying something politically incorrect? And yet the only answer is to have courage, because without courage, all the other virtues are meaningless. All of our knowledge is meaningless. All of our sense of what an activist should do is meaningless if we don't have the courage to speak up. We must model courage. Stand up against the idols of popular culture of our day. And if we do, and if we look at history and have faith, I have no doubt that Zionism will not only prosper, but so will our own community despite its challenges. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Yes, sir. Why don't you stand up so everybody can hear?
You didn't mention anything about
I'll try and repeat it. I think I can hear, so.
You didn't mention the territories that a lot of people believe are immoral and Israel doesn't belong. In 1948, 1967, if we had stopped going into another part of the Middle East, then things would be very different now. We would do one way or the other. But I'm curious about why you didn't mention that before, and the reason that I was, it just was a red light in my mind, was that it goes against those territories go against my own value system as a Jewish person. I'm a huge supporter of Israel. I lived there for a year, my kids are there, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to dichotomy of Jewish values that I grew up with versus the behavior of the Jewish government, the Israeli government since 1967, I have not been able to reconcile it. Do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, well, I think, if you want to go counterfactuals with what would Israel have done if it somehow defended itself in 1967 but didn't come into possession of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, I don't think that really is one that sort of plays out very logically, because without that, well, then you kind of have, the reason why, as I noted, there is a consensus against against further territorial sacrifices in Israel is that, what happened when they left Gaza in 2005. Israel withdrew every soldier, settler, and settlement from Gaza in 2005 in the hope of, creating a laboratory for peace. There were wealthy Jews in this country purchased the greenhouses that have been built in the settlements there, with the idea of giving them to the Palestinians, and then there would be a whole economic boost. And of course, those facilities didn't last more than a few hours. They were torn down along with every vestige of where Jews were. What happened in Gaza is now there is an independent Palestinian state in all but name that is governed by a terrorist group, Hamas, that is dedicated to Israel's destruction and which is used as a terrorist launching pad. They are not, the people, Hamas is not seeking to merely adjust Israel's borders so that it would leave Judea and Samaria, West Bank. They want the right of return to extirpate the entire Jewish state. That is what is at stake, and I think the majority of Israeli Jews believe that to replicate that same experiment, don't listen to me, listen to just ordinary, Israeli opinion, to replicate that experiment in the much larger areas in the West Bank, more strategic. People in Tel Aviv act like, sort of Gaza is sort of like in Afghanistan, but they understand that that's not true for the West Bank. To replicate that there would not be so much ill-advised, but insane, because unfortunately the Palestinian national movement is still dedicated to no Jewish state. That we hope will change eventually, but it will require a sea change in the culture of the Palestinians. It will not be achieved by merely, an act of withdrawal because we think it's more, because that's moral. On the other hand, many Jews in Israel believe that, and I think have a leg to stand to say that Jews have a right to live there too, and that if a sort of Jew-free West Bank was the solution for peace, there would have been peace before 1967. So I think, I understand your concerns because it is an anomalous situation. And it's an anomalous situation that could have been over more than 20 years ago had the Palestinians ever taken yes for an answer. I don't mean to say that this is, I'm not interested in sort of a paradigm of teaching about this situation where the Jews are just the good guys, the Arabs are just the bad guys. The Palestinians have their own point of view. I get where they are. They don't want there to be a Jewish state. They don't want to be a national minority, even those who, Arabs who live inside of Israel within a majority Jewish state. It's a difficult thing for them to accept. And yet, if there's going to be peace, they're going to have to accept it. And so, I think the notion that Israel can unilaterally create an atmosphere of peace, create a peace partner, has been tried and it's failed. That's the reality of Israeli politics. Benjamin Netanyahu was elected 4 times to be prime minister of Israel, not because everybody loves him, but because basically the Palestinians elected him. And, you know, the parties in the Knesset, after the dust settles after this next election, will be divided about how they feel about Netanyahu, but there'll probably be about 75 to 80 members of the Knesset who are basically right-wing by the standards of this argument about what to do about the West Bank. So that's the reality. So it's part of this debate, but merely withdrawing from the West Bank is not, you know, it may satisfy some Jews' belief. You know, many Jews think that that would be wrong, but leaving that aside, it would say, well, that's moral. But the fact is, if a two-state solution were what the other side wanted, there would have been a two-state solution a long time ago. Indeed, there would have been a two-state solution in 1947, but there wasn't, and that's where we are. That's the anomaly. I'm not saying it's an ideal, it's an anomalous situation, it's an unpleasant situation, but the fact that it still exists 50 years after 1967 is not because the Jews are rapacious imperialists and immoral, and all Israeli governments since 1967 have been immoral. It's because none of them had a peace partner. Sir. A microphone is a good solution.
Yeah, thank you. And let's talk about Israel PR.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Oh, Israeli PR. Okay, yeah.
First of all, I want to thank Wendy and Ivy to organize the event, and thank you for coming. And let's talk about Judea and Samaria, called West Bank. It's called occupied territory. In my view, it's not occupied territory. We just returned to our homeland. I mean, God promised us that land, the Balfour Declaration promised our land. We lost it in 48, we recaptured it in 67, and that's why it's our home. That's where we originated. Now, the thing is, I think Israel lacked the PR to explain people such the American Jewry and the whole world, it's not occupied. After 48, Israel observed 1 million people from Arab countries in settlement, one country. There were just 700,000 refugees, Palestinian refugees. And 7 countries couldn't absorb them. Palestinians had enough opportunities to create their own state, and they refused to create their own state. And the thing is getting escalated and more and more and more. Right now, I mean, Arafat and Abbas, it was a business because they became very multimillionaire. It's one of the reasons they didn't want to come to peace. And I like your views about what Israel is lacking as far as the PR, explaining the situation, what was happening between them and Palestinians.
Okay, I think this is a common complaint. Thank you for your question. And thank you for reminding me to thank Randy and Ivy and everybody who was involved with this program. You know, it's a common American complaint among Jewish activists, like Israeli PR is terrible. You know, the Hasbara in Hebrew, Israel does a terrible job explaining itself to the world. And there is a lot of truth to that. It's almost like an integral to sort of the national character of the Israeli people, that to have to explain yourself to other people is somehow undignified. And I think for a long, long time, most of Israel's envoys, those in charge of those who spoke on its behalf, really kind of didn't get it that much about how you sort of put your case across to the world. And indeed, you know, many, you know, sort of succumb to ideas, well, looking for shortcuts. And, you know, there was, my favorite story about this is about 10 guess 13, 14, 10, 12 years ago, the Israeli foreign minister came up with the idea that what they really needed to sell Israel to the world was to rebrand it, sort of like some marketing people had gotten hold of their, he says, yes, it's a marketing problem. It's not, it's not a problem of peace. It's not a problem of ideas. It's a marketing problem. We have to rebrand Israel as a country with beautiful beaches, pretty girls on the beaches, and brilliant scientists solving, curing diseases. And if only we focus people, if we talk about that, then they won't call Israel an apartheid state and they won't say terrible things about Israel. And this reached its apogee, this experiment, I think it was 2008 in New York, when New York's consulate had a joint event with Maxim magazine, which was, a magazine that, specialized in, sort of salacious pictures of women. And sort of had, sort of the girls of the IDF issue. And actually, Gal Gadot was part of this because this was before she became Wonder Woman. And it was like they went native on Madison Avenue, and it was ridiculous. And it was ridiculous not just because the state of Israel should not be, doing joint events with Maxim magazine. It was ridiculous because it doesn't matter how pretty Israel's beaches are or how attractive its women or men are, and the beaches are gorgeous and the people are gorgeous. And its scientists are brilliant and they cure diseases and do all these amazing things. But if you think Israel is an apartheid state, you won't care how pretty the beaches are or how pretty the people are or how smart the scientists are. If you think it's an oppressor, if you think it's immoral, there's no way to solve the conflict but to address the conflict. And, the gentleman who posed the question is right. Yes, Israel has to put its case forward, even on controversial things like the West Bank, and say, listen, this is a dispute. Both sides have rights there. Let's talk about it. Let's be realistic about it. And I think to the extent that it tries not to do that, it always fails. And to the extent that even American Jewry engages in sort of promoting Israel and tries to avoid discussions of the difficult topics, we fail. We have to address the typical topics. We don't, when faced with anti-Zionists and sort of people sort of mired in this ideology, which really enables anti-Semitism, our reaction, our answer has to be to challenge them on the facts, to challenge them head on. It's like, in the Seder, when we're taught how do you address the, sort of the obdurate child. You're supposed to, blunt his teeth, to basically get in his face. That's what we have to do. We have to address the actual issues. And to the extent that Israeli Hezbollah tries not to do that, to the extent that Israeli diplomats, God bless them, just want to keep being invited to the parties at the UN and not be, angry with people, I think they fail. And I think Israel's PR has often failed because of that. Because on the one hand, they don't want to deign to explain themselves, and on the other hand, they want to avoid the issue.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Groom.
I'm Marcel Groen, and I appreciate your comments, but I'm concerned about one aspect of it. I read your article, so I'm not surprised in what troubles me. The trouble is that as Jews, we have to be careful for both the far left and the far right, of which you have made no comment. And it is true that we should fight with everything we have in terms of making sure that our kids are safe in colleges, that they get the right ideas, and that we can fight the far left. But in this world, in addition to that, fascism is the far right. Synagogues that get bombed get bombed by the far right. My concern is that once you start mentioning one group, a moderate person from the left might not feel comfortable, any more than a moderate person from the right would not feel comfortable if it's all about the right. And so my suggestion is that we need to talk about the American moderate. Thank God for the American moderates, okay? Whether it's from George Bush to Bill Clinton, you don't have to disagree with all of their policies. They all loved Israel. And so I'm concerned by the manner in which you have read what you've written and what you now said, because you only go in one direction, and I wish it was only one direction, but we have to be honest. It's both directions, and we have to be careful.
Well, I think if you actually read my work consistently, in fact, I lost almost 1,000 Twitter followers last week when I attacked Candace Owen and the Daily Wire for their defense of Kanye West. I've written a lot about right-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence. So for you to say that, I never address that, that's simply not true. In terms of the debate about Zionism, that is a debate that's happened on the left. That's why I addressed it. I was asked to address Zionism here, certainly not to talk about partisanship, which is kind of where you're going there. There are pro-Israel people on both sides of the political spectrum, but there's only a debate on one side of our political spectrum right now. And that's a debate that is happening, unfortunately, on the left. The intersectional left has far more influence right now in our political sphere than the far anti-Semitic violent right does. They really don't have a political wing which has any power. Fortunately, they don't. The intersectional left does have a tenuous representation now, but they are very prevalent in academia, they're very prevalent in the press, and they are growing in legitimacy. And when we debate Zionism, we're not debating with sort of far-right lunatics who are themselves also anti-Zionist among their many other conspiracy theories. We're debating with a movement that specifically targets Israel and Zionism. This is something that concerns all of us. And it's something we have to, we just have to confront it. This is not that's a political debate. What to do about violent extremists is not a political debate. That's a security debate. So that's why in the context of a debate about Zionism, I discussed the movement that is against Zionism, that has representatives in Congress, that is basically taken over academia in this country, even Israel studies in this country. So that's why we have to address it. And of course, we have to seek allies everywhere. But in doing so, we have to be honest about it. And that's what I'm trying to do here. Sir. It's just like Broadway shows. Nobody can do anything without microphones anymore, right?
A few months ago, Cameron came out with data to show the president of Target that they should not sell anti-Semitic books, not of the Holocaust. And I don't know one Jewish organization or any Jewish clergy that came out and said we should call Target and write to Target they should not sell these Holocaust denial books. It's not a right-wing issue, not a left-wing issue, it's not a pro-Democrat, anti-Democrat, anti-Republican, pro-Republican. Jewish leadership does not seem to be speaking out in general against anti-Semitism. The stuff going on at colleges, the current thing going on with the law school at Berkeley, and why do you feel the Jewish leadership is just not thinking to take a stand on a lot of these issues?
Well, I think that these are real problems, and obviously I've addressed them, and I'm not gainsaying what you're saying, but to say that Jewish organizations as a whole, even some of those Jewish organizations with which I have a lot of disagreements, obviously they care about these issues. They do speak about these issues. I think sometimes they speak up ineffectively. I think sometimes they get drawn into partisanship in a way that is unproductive and doesn't really address the problems. But we could have all the leaders of, the major organizations here. They would say a lot of the same things that I have said. So I don't think that it's not that they don't care. It's that, there are real questions here. I mean, I'm going to go on a slight tangent from what you said, but there are real issues here for us to debate about how do we address anti-Semitic hate, whether it's from the right or whether it's from the left, sort of in public forums. Where do we draw the line about just between free speech and from things that are incitement to hatred and we shouldn't allow? Now, the truth is, somebody like Kanye West, somebody like Candace Owens, somebody, pick your, Louis Farrakhan even, they have every right to say whatever they want to say. This is a free country. The First Amendment applies to them. We don't have to patronize, their goods. You don't have to buy Kanye West stuff. I have to admit, I was a little ignorant about how important and influential he was until he really started becoming, got into onto my radar screen. It turns out he was more than a rap star. He was just like this fashion mogul. Who knew? It's like you can only know about so many things. But, it's a question of how do we deal with it on the internet? A lot of, some of our major Jewish organizations have been really adamant about banning anti-Semitic hate or Holocaust denial in various forums, and on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to that, and we have to, where incitement to violence is something that is illegal and, should not be given a home anywhere. On the other hand, just things, bad opinions and extreme opinions, or even advocacy for BDS, advocacy for anti-Zionism. If we want to have a free country, we have to allow all of these things, these ideas to percolate, and we have to defeat them. We have to defeat them with the truth. So yes, I think people should speak up to Target or any organization that is doing things that are deeply offensive. They should know better than to sell Holocaust denial. On the other hand, we're always going to be put in situations where there's a line between free speech, even speech we find abhorrent, and the rights of, our right not to be threatened. The calculus to decide that is not clear. It's not always obvious. As a journalist, as a free speech advocate, I'm always on the side of let people say what they want to say. I mean, Twitter is a sewer, and people say horrible things to me on it every day. It's really amazing. Occasionally, sometimes people say nice things too, but but that's the public square. That is in our time, where we used to pride ourselves in the idea that people could get up and on a soapbox and say whatever they wanted, no matter how crazy it was. That's what Twitter is. Everybody has a soapbox. That's hard to live with at times, and at times it can be dangerous. But I believe we have to err on the side of free speech, because if we don't, we're not living in a free society, and the consequences of that are far worse than anything else. Somebody else who hasn't asked a question?
We just want to let people know that we're going to move maybe one more question so that we could be here for another hour.
Yeah, I know people want to get home to watch the game tonight, right?
We're not staying that long.
I wouldn't think so.
So Israel...
Great shirt, by the way. That's really something.
Go Phillies.
See it 2 blocks
Thank you.
away.
Israel, since its very inception, has been under fire from most of the world. I think they've handled it pretty good so far. Right now, they find themselves in a predicament because they've got pretty much a handshake agreement with Russia, and Russia's in charge of the skies and the land in Syria, keeping Iranian weapons from getting to Hezbollah, to Hamas. And now that Russia's invaded Ukraine, you got a Jewish president in Ukraine. They haven't officially come out and supported Ukraine. What do they do?
Well, you point to a great dilemma. I mean, I've written about this, a lot recently, and if my daughter were here, she's at school, she would say, don't just stand there and quote yourself. But Israel is in an anomalous situation, and I would correct the posing of your question in one way. Israel has actually spoken up and said it supports Ukraine's right to self-determination and existence. It's actually sent lots of aid to the Ukrainians, medical aid, humanitarian aid. It's taken in refugees. I'm sorry? Yeah, well, okay, but it has not sort of joined the war. It has not sent weapons. And the reasons for that are twofold. One is that Russia is not just a country in Europe. Russia is Israel's neighbor now, because Russia largely controls Syria. It's withdrawn some of its troops and aircraft, but it still is a major player in Syria since the Civil War. Russia and Iran intervened and defeated, the people trying to overthrow the barbarous, Bashar Assad regime. And it has sort of allowed a modus vivendi with Israel in which it more or less allows Israel free rein over the skies of Syria to attack Iranian and various terrorist targets. And to lose that, or to somehow put itself in a confrontation with both Russia and the Syrian regime as well as Iran, is obviously something that all of Israel's leaders, it's not a partisan thing, view with great trepidation. Israel's got enough problems on its northern front with Hezbollah, with its tens and thousands of missiles pointing at Israel every day, and with an Iranian presence in Syria. So it's got to deal with that. There's also the question of the large Jewish community that still exists in Russia, and which I have to say the Putin regime has not made too fine a point about threatening. And it specifically threatened the activities of the Jewish Agency in Russia. That was a shot fired across Israel's bow about you've gone so far, go further, and you'll lose some of your assets in this war. There is an argument that Israel should just do the moral thing and support Ukraine and its right to defend itself in its war. On the other hand, Israel has other interests. It has, all countries have to defend their own interests. And I think to single out Israel, of all the countries in the world, as and quite frankly, as Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has done, is quite unfair. Obviously, he's got his own concerns. He's only worried about Ukraine, as he wants all the allies, and he's willing to pull out all the stops. We kind of judge Ukraine by we grade them on a curve. When Zelensky spoke to the Knesset earlier this year in a virtual speech, and he said things, he said, the Ukrainian people stood with you, the Jewish people, during the Holocaust, so you have to stand with us. And it's like, I don't even have to, and it's like, what? What? Alas, the Ukrainians were the Russians' greatest collaborators. The horror at Babi Yar was largely done by the Ukrainians, not by the German Nazis. So, had any other European leader said anything like that, had the Polish leaders who have run afoul of the Jewish world for saying similar things, but actually nothing quite that egregious, we'd be, treating him as a pariah, but because Ukraine is under attack from Russia, everybody just sort of and then just moved on from it. The focus on Israel, and the idea that it should give some of its sort of, you mentioned the Iron Dome and all that, Israel's worried about, leaving aside the realpolitik issues, as Lord Palmerston said, all nations, no nations have permanent allies, only permanent interests. Israel is guarding its interests. For it to put its, highest security stuff, in the hands of another nation, without safeguards, without having, that's a pretty perilous thing to do. The Israelis don't want to do that, and they don't want to be drawn into this war more than they've already been. Ultimately, they may. Listen, who knows what Putin will do? If Putin, goes further, another irony is that for all of the horror of the Putin regime, he largely protected the Jewish community He's that anomalous Russian leader who did not seem to have something up his nose about the Jews throughout his, 20-odd years of dictatorial rule. And yet, that may come to an end soon, and in which point we will be having a very different conversation about Russia. But I think to blame Israel or to single out Israel is always getting judged by a double standard on all sorts of issues. I think to single out Israel and sort of saying it must put Ukraine's interests in the sort of the general war against Putin above its own, which I'm not saying is what you said, but I'm saying that's kind of some of the rhetoric we've gotten about this. I don't think that's fair. I think Israel is going to do what's in its own interest. And I think that's what the Israeli people, the Israeli voters, no matter who they're voting for on Tuesday, expect its leaders to do. I think that's what Lapid is doing. I think that's what Netanyahu would do if he were back in power. But again, that's a fluid situation. It could change. It could get worse. On the other hand, it's worth asking, at some point that war is going to have to end. It's going to have to be solved, because it's not like either side seems to have the ability to ultimately defeat each other. And I think some of our rhetoric acts as if, Ukraine will, with the help of other countries, will, sort of totally defeat Russia. It's a nuclear power. We in this country forbear. We stood aside while the Soviet Union did horrible things during the Cold War. Its invasion of Hungary in 1956, its invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and we just said, sorry, we're really sympathetic, but we're not starting a nuclear war for you. I'm deeply sympathetic. I think everybody should be deeply sympathetic to the right of the Ukrainian people, whatever happened during World War II, to self-determination and to not be invaded by a larger dictatorial neighbor. But, we shouldn't be getting into a nuclear war over that either. And that's not a satisfying answer, but I think it's kind of the reality.
We are going to have one last question. I know that many people want to ask, and maybe if Jonathan is willing to stay.
Okay, well, that lady in the back,
But there's someone who's the spouse of the chair of our...
Don wants to ask something, all right.
Special privilege, and...
Are we going to let Don talk, really?
No, please. This is the last formal question, and then anything else that happens from here on is informal, because we're going to thank you, and let people who take Shabbos naps do so.
Jonathan, when you spoke about Don Siegel-Beshel, you spoke about courage and the importance of having courage. That really resonated me, because I want to make a statement and get your response. It's my belief that a lot of our national Jewish leaders, and I'm thinking of the ADL, perhaps among others, do not have the courage to call out those committing anti-Semitic acts or engaging in anti-Semitic practices. And I want to specifically address the issue of college campuses. Most of us here have older children who went to college in a time when college was safe, but many of us have grandchildren. I could look around the room, and I'm looking at some folks whose grandchildren have experienced anti-Semitism on college campuses. And a lot of that is neither what you might say the right or the left, unless Marcel and you consider Muslim students and Islamist students and students for justice in Palestine part of the left. If you do, then you included it. But if you don't, to me, there is a major problem growing in America. It began on college campuses of Muslim students and Arab students and those sympathetic to them as part of Students for Justice in Palestine. And the fact that they harass Jewish students and get away with it, you walk by the buildings, they're all given by Jews, NYU, Columbia, and all these other places. It's terrible. And it culminated, the lack of calling out the Muslim community in America, it culminated in the violent attacks on Jews in California, Florida, and Illinois. So I'd like to ask you, is there a political correctness, whether it's Hillel Committee, American Jewish Committee, engage with the dialogue with the Muslim group or the ADL, do they engage in a political correctness to not call out the Muslim anti-Semitism? And if they do, it's worrisome, because we see what is happening, and it has happened to Jews in Germany, France, Sweden, England, and so forth. So I'd like to get your honest response about that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I would hope I would always give an honest response.
What do we do with our children? Make them
Okay, well, I'll try to address both of those questions. Listen, I have big issues with the ADL and to the lesser extent with the AG committee. I think they do a lot of things that I think are mistaken. I would not speak of them in absolutes that they're always wrong and that they don't care about anti-Semitism. Of course they care about it. I think some of their responses are ineffective. I think sometimes they're focused on the wrong things. And I think in many respects, American Jewish leadership has consistently failed. They didn't just fail now. I mean, we have a long history of failure, on these issues. But again, let me address, one thought at a time. But obviously, I think, we need to address those issues of Islamist anti-Semitism and Students of Justice of Palestine. You mentioned this is an anti-Semitic hate group. It traffics in anti-Semitism. And it troubles me when Jewish groups on the far left normalize them. Certainly AJC and ADL don't do that. I think they often sometimes are addicted. I believe in interfaith dialogue, but interfaith dialogue has to be based on honesty and not on ignoring fundamental problems. I think groups like CARE need to be, Council of American Islamic Relations, which is a very radical, very, would have its roots, as a fund for, fundraising for Hamas, and is a profoundly negative influence. It sort of masquerades as a civil rights group. It's anything but. And I think major groups often don't confront that. But, again, my message isn't, damn all the Jewish groups. When I think they're failing, I call them out. But, I want them all to succeed. I'm not here to, I'm not in favor of defunding any of them, and certainly ADL raises like $100 million a year. They don't have to worry about that. But to address, your question now, how do we do something about, students? I think that, and not just students, all children, and all of us, yes. I think we have to go back to the fundamentals, understand why Zionism is important to us, understand that to be a Jew and is to, in a sense, take up the cudgels for Jewish identity, and Zionism is integral to that. And that goes to education, or Jewish schools, to the extent that they are practicing Zionist education, and there's failures on that front too. That's why Jewish camps, so trips to Israel. It's the solutions to this problem are not, it's not like nobody thought of it before. We just have to practice it more. We have to fund them more. We have to fund I'm talking about something I've been writing about for 30 years, funding Jewish education and making, a good Jewish education an entitlement. That's something our Jewish community has largely failed to do, even where we've tried to address it. Same with Jewish camps, same with trips to Israel. Fortunately, there have been some rich people that have funded Birthright and anybody who wants to. But our problem, just to go to the real heart of what you're saying, sometimes, we can't spend our way out of these problems because it goes to sort of who we are as a sort of a Jewish tribe in this country. I speak of the importance of Jewish education. I saw the rabbi nodding. We're so in agreement on that. But if there's one thing I have learned in covering the Jewish community, spending my adult life covering the Jewish community, is that as far as probably the majority of American Jewish parents are concerned, you couldn't pay them to send their kids to a Jewish school. That's just, yes, the high cost of Jewish living is a huge problem, but an even greater problem is the fact that American Jews are largely assimilating and aren't interested in their heritage or, aren't interested in becoming part of this civilization and see their future sort of outside of it. That's what we have to do. That's what we have to grab. Often we talk about why don't young Jews like Israel, and people blame the politics and people blame it on Netanyahu or pick your pinata. The truth is, it's more about demographics than it's about Israeli politics or American politics. It's about a largely assimilating, disintegrating, sort of non-Orthodox Jewry in this country, where the largest group, the fastest growing group of Jews, read any demographic study, are quote-unquote Jews of no religion, which is to say, not merely that they don't go to shul with us, is that they really are discarding all the normative ideas about what it means to be a Jew, a sense of Jewish peoplehood, which is at the core of support for Zionism. If you don't feel a sense of Jewish peoplehood, why should you care about Israel? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. That's a real problem here. And that's, that's not something we're going to solve while I'm standing here on one foot. But it is something that as a community, we have to do all of these things. And even if we do them all, we also have to understand that in a free country, people are going to opt out, and we're going to lose them. And that's a reality. But let me end on a more hopeful note. I still believe, people ask me, like, are you pessimistic about things? I always say I'm a short-term pessimist, I'm a long-term optimist. I think that is quintessentially Jewish, and I think it's something all of us should feel when we think about Israel or the Jewish future in this country.
We want to thank Jonathan for his incredible time with us. We want to thank our Israel Engagement Committee for bringing him to us and for all the wonderful program we're doing. For those of you who didn't get a chance to ask your questions, we are sorry, but this would have gone on for another 3 hours if everyone's question was asked. Sign of a great talk that no one wants to leave. And again, thank you to our wonderful guest and to our committee for making this happen. Shabbat shalom.
Choose us.